there's so many things to talk to you about, and we don't want to waste a second. Let's just start out. What do you think's happening with this election? You know, you're such a prominent political commentator and critic of the president at the moment, and you're so feet on the ground with Wall Street. You have a perspective, I think, that's urgent. What is happening right now, in your view?
Well, look, I want to be as objective as possible. Obviously, I have an opinion, which I sometimes share on late, primetime cable news channels, but I want to be objective. I think you've got two things going on right now, and there's a culture war. And so the reason why the president has so much support, frankly, is there's a very large group of the population that see him as the last white man standing to prevent what will be the radical left coming up over the transom, overwhelming the culture and changing the society. And so up against that, you have arguably a return to what I would call the modern political establishment under the auspices of Vice President Biden. And so there's a struggle going on right now. And again, people will probably be upset with me if they're for the president, but I think he's dug himself a hole and he's lost a very large group of moderates. He's lost a large group of seniors, and he's lost a large group of suburban women, as well as women of all shapes and sizes and demography, because of the mishandling of the crisis, which has caused a domino effect into the economy, and the bellicosity of his rhetoric and the bullying. I mean, you've got suburban housewives around the country, David, trying to teach their children about anti-bullying, and you've got the president of the United States operating his Twitter feed like he's a combination of a Russian bot and a bully in a middle school. So those things.
Hey, even his wife is trying to do that. His wife
tries
so
those things have hurt him. So to me, I take the polls for what they are. I think he's going to get trounced in the election. Now, I was with him 4 years ago. I was with him after the Access Hollywood tape. I do think this is different. He was the unknown entity at that time, and he was running against somebody that represented the establishment who was quite polarizing. I think the great irony here is he's the polarizing candidate of this election. And so people will say, well, he has more enthusiasm on his side. That may be true, but there's a tremendous amount of enthusiasm for people to go out and vote against him. And so that sort of happened in 2016 in reverse. And I'm not smart enough to tell you who's going to win, and I'm not dumb enough, frankly, to tell you to rule him out. I think you have to see this thing through November 3rd and see what happens. But it does feel like he's going to lose the election by fairly sizable numbers.
One thing I pick up from the way you started out talking about this is you do have empathy for the people who support him. And I think so many people who are opposed to Trump unfortunately fall into the pit of condemning all of his followers too, which is really kind of just going to compound the problems this country is going to continue to have regardless of who's the next president. Just talk a little bit about your thinking about that. Is there any pathway to coming together, and do you see a need for more empathy concretely?
Well, listen, I certainly see a need for empathy. I did a frontline interview a few weeks ago which basically expressed empathy also for the president. I think there's a lot of pain there, and I think that there's a little bit of mania going on if you're really studying it. And I think what ends up happening is we drop into two silos. Somebody called me on a network this morning a never Trumper. I'm like, time out. How can you call me a never Trumper? I worked for the guy.
You were once a Trumper.
I was once a Trumper. You can call me once a Trumper or used to be a Trumper, but you can't call me a never Trumper, because I understand the dilemma that the society's in. I understand the causes that the president represents, and I understand the economic desperation that many blue collar families feel. And David, I grew up in a blue collar family out on Long Island. My dad was a crane operator in a sand mine that ultimately became a large public golf course once all of the sand was excavated from the mine. And he had a very good wage. It was an hourly wage, but it put us in the middle class in a fairly affluent town that was tied to a good public school system. So I'm a direct beneficiary of a good public school system growing up in a middle class area. But my dad's wages, if you were to price my dad's wages 40 years later, same union, assuming that job even exists, it's not there anymore, but let's say it did exist, it would be down about 26% in real economic terms. And so you've transformed a generation of blue collar Americans from aspirational blue collar families into desperational ones. And if you like the president or you dislike the president, you have to recognize that he saw that in 2016. He went into those areas that felt underserved, where they felt that there was a vacuum of advocacy from the establishment. So what I'm hoping will happen, and I think the vice president understands this, he's from Scranton, PA. My dad's originally from Wilkes-Barre. I think the vice president has given a couple of really good speeches. The one in Gettysburg was a good one about being the president for all people and trying to create a unifying message and trying to come up with policies that will help those people. Of course, if Mr. Trump wins again, what I would say is he's effective at being an avatar for their anger. He's effective at being the proverbial thumb in the eye of the elites, the media, the establishment, the coastal cities. He's good at putting his thumb in the eye, but he really hasn't done much from a policy perspective to help those people. So if he wins again, my suggestion to him and his team, you got to really come up with some policies here, because one thing that happened in COVID-19 is that wealth disparity, David, has gotten wider in the last 6 months, dangerously wide, I might add. And the next administration, whoever it may be, needs to come up with policies to help those people.
Well, I've got a lot of questions about the economy and the markets, but let's just quickly stick on the election just for one or two more. You know the guy. What do you think are you somebody who thinks we're going to see an October surprise of truly manic proportions that might throw things into even a more bizarre scenario? What do you think we should expect in the remaining days here?
Well, listen, I mean, I guess they have a surprise today with the allegations against Hunter Biden. I think they're trying to make that into an October surprise. I'm not sure how much of that's going to stick, frankly. There seems to be some hypocrisy on both sides when it relates to the families. There may be another surprise. I mean, Mr. Trump is known for that. He's a showman. He wants to create a moment that will create lots of ratings. I will point out that he had the opportunity to present himself in front of 60 or 70 million people on Thursday night. He's elected not to do that. And so that's telling you something. He doesn't want to stand on stage with Joe Biden and have a reconciliation of everything that he's done in the presidency. You know, I would maintain, and his detractors would maintain, that he's made the country weaker. He's made the country sicker and poorer. And so you don't want 90 minutes to go by on a national stage like that, 60 to 70 million people. So if you look at the first debate, he started off okay. He was saying some things about the Supreme Court. I think he was winning some favor there. And then it started to get bad because it went badly because he was talking about the COVID-19. He failed on that, the destruction of the economy. It was his decision-making and lack of executive skills that caused for that economic destruction. And then all of a sudden he said, oh my God, I got to start interrupting the vice president for the next 90 minutes because I can't have him standing there breaking through the reality into the reality. You know, I have my base in a community, in certain media channels and certain places that they absorb information from in this reality distortion field. I can't have Joe Biden coming into this thing and breaking through that reality distortion. So, you know, when he got sick, I said, there's no way he's going to that next debate. They say he's going to go to the third debate. I predict that he won't, because how is he going to stand there? He knows the vice president doesn't have dementia. He knows the vice president's a very well-prepared, disciplined guy. He's not going to be able to stand there with the vice president. The ad hominem attacks is not working, and he has nothing really of significance to run on because of what happened as a result of COVID-19.
Well, the polling just got way worse for him after that first debate. I mean, it just like dramatic increase in the differential there. One of the things, you know, you were in a fairly big article in the Times yesterday about Republicans who have become Trump critics. If he loses, and if, you know, we know that he's not going to admit he lost. We don't know. I mean, presumably he's going to have to step out of office. But if he really refuses to accept a loss and tries to play some serious shenanigans, do you think more Republicans will likely turn on him in that scenario?
I do think that. By the way, I might say this to you, David, you're doing a brilliant job of handling the Mike Pence fly that's zooming around your head there.
I know.
See you.
Thank you for
You're doing
noticing
brilliant.
that.
So far,
Damn it.
it
I
hasn't
hope
landed on your head.
it was a
Okay?
Mike
And so,
Fence fly. Yes, I
yeah,
don't have
so
fly hair, so
I'm
a
very
great-
impressed with the way you're handling that. It's almost like a whole jujitsu thing
Did
going
you
on
notice
there.
that one of my
But
earpieces fell out onto the floor on the other side of the room?
I noticed that as well, but I thought you were handling that well too. So I didn't want to call you on that.
You got to do what you got to do.
But the fly is spectacular. So listen, I mean, yes, I do think that look, I mean, you don't have to be a rocket scientist. You're a journalist. You have sources inside of Washington. I still talk to people inside the White House. I still talk to people inside high levels of the cabinet, across the departments, and obviously people up on the Hill. So you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that they're somewhat fatigued on the Republican side in terms of how the president is handling himself stylistically. And so if he loses, Mitch McConnell has said very pointedly that he will be at the tip of the spear asking the president to leave. And so it's sort of astonishing that we have to have that conversation, the notion that he's not willingly accepting the idea of a peaceful transfer of power. I do think that that's bluster. I think that's not going to be a surprise to anybody, but it was a surprise to me about how insecure the president is. I thought, given the magnitude of his achievements and the fact that he ascended into the American presidency, there would be more security there and more self-confidence. You know, behind me on my shelf is a plaque from Reagan that says you can get anywhere in your life as long as you don't care who gets the credit. And secure people that are self-confident, business leaders.
What a contrast.
Jim McCann as an example, where we know him well.
Great
he knows
example.
how to delegate. He knows how to offer up autonomy and responsibility to the people underneath him. And so that creates a wider, flatter, more competent organization. But if you're insecure, I told one of the cabinet members that was humiliated by the president on Twitter, I said, well, he's a modern day Inca. You're walking in with your resume, your pedigree, your ability to speak complete sentences, the love of your family. He's knocked off guard by that and insecure about it. And so he wants to throw you into the volcano of his personal self-hatred. And he did that to Kelly. He did it to Mattis. He did it to Tillerson. And that's what he does. And so, listen, it's a hard thing because you can't run the office of the presidency and the executive branch of the United States as a one-man Broadway play. You just can't run it that way. And I think that's the reason why we're in all of this trouble. And I think the Republicans know that. So if it's a close election and Joe Biden is up, they're going to ask him to go.
Hey, I was going to ask you a question about what happens if Biden wins, and we'll get there in a minute, but we've gotten two people just come in and ask the exact same question, which is about the debt that Trump owes that the New York Times tax investigation revealed. And what do you think, how significant do you see that to be? This came from Mark Seiden and John Goldberg, both asking the same question. Is that part of the reason for his stress? John asked, but how do you analyze that as in this whole picture?
Well, I'll say something surprising. Again, I want to be sympathetic and as objective as possible. I think he is very good, President Trump, at compartmentalizing. And so I think right now, inside of his field of vision is the next 2.5, 3 weeks, he's got to win the election. If he wins the election, he can stave off these investigations. He can probably figure out a way to pay off that debt. A lot of good things happen to him and his family if he wins the election. So I think he's missile locked on trying to do that. And I think he's very good at that. I think all of those other external stresses he's able to dial off of to focus on what's right in front of him. But longer term, yes, I think that debt is problematic. Who does he owe it to? David Enrich has written a great book about his relationship with Deutsche Bank. He probably owes it to Deutsche Bank, frankly, who signed for it to offer up further collateral in addition to his buildings and properties and things like that. I think that's an open question. And does he have the assets to pay it back? He probably does have the assets to pay it back, but does he have the liquidity to do so? I think it's pretty clear from his financial statements that he doesn't. So there will be a reckoning. If he loses the election, he's going to probably have to deal with certain investigations at the state level here in New York or at the city level through Cyrus Vance. And he's going to have to deal with that bullet coming at him as it relates to his debt. So there's a lot of incentives for him to win. There are political incentives and there are personal incentives, which is why I think you see higher and higher levels of mania, higher levels of conspiracy theories. on his Twitter feed. This morning on the Twitter feed, he's suggesting that Osama bin Laden was held in Iran and he was brought to Pakistan to be killed off by the Americans. And I don't know if you read that, but I mean, he's
I've been busy moderating a conference.
Yeah. So, I mean, listen, this is the sort of stuff that people do when they're under high amounts of pressure and they're trying to see if that sort of conspiracy stuff. Remember, there's a lot of people that feel disaffected from the system or left out of the system. And Mr. Trump is trying to embrace them and prey on them and whatever their weaknesses are by suggesting these conspiracies. Again, I don't know if there's enough people. I choose to see the better side of America. I think that there is more people that are of sound and reasonable mind that recognize that we don't want to have another 4 years of this, and that the policies are not even that good, actually. So I don't know who's arguing that these are Republican policies, because if you look at the deficit spending and the approach to tariffs and the bellicosity towards our longstanding Western alliance, those are not necessarily traditional Republican ideas. So
not at all.
I don't know. We'll have to see what happens, but the country will survive it one way or the other.
Yeah, what eventually happens to your party is a really interesting question we may not have time for here. You wrote a great piece this week, which I really found actually bracing and reassuring, in which the headline was something like, "You're bullish on the economy despite COVID and Trump." And so I guess you should talk a little bit about why, but if you can roll into that, let's say Biden wins, what's that going to mean for the economy and the markets?
Well, let's just step backwards. We have people like Steve Case in this economy, Jim McCann in this economy. You pick the other panelists that you've had at your amazing conference in this economy. We have a nation of entrepreneurs and innovators, people that are resilient. They can ride through tough times. They have an immigrant history by and large, which is obviously built-in risk-taking. And so, yes, I think we are going to come out of this better than ever. I point people back to the pandemic of 1918. In 3 short years, by 2021, we were creating electric grids, even in rural areas of the United States. We were building bridges, roads, and tunnels and airports. And lo and behold, we had this roar in the decade of the 1920s. And I think there's going to be a tremendous amount of pent-up demand, pent-up consumerism. And I think we will, as every pandemic, from the time of Justinian and that pandemic to 1918 to today, the world has come out of these pandemics, and they've by and large come out of the pandemic stronger, more resilient, and more innovative. I know my little company's had to innovate as a result of what's going on. Your conference and your industry has also had to innovate, and a result of
this
which
is new.
Will be tough. Yeah, we'll be tougher, we'll be leaner, and I think we'll be made better for it. And the last point I want to make about this is the Fed has figured this out from a crisis management perspective. It turns out that 2008 was a dress rehearsal for COVID-19 2020. And I think they've done a masterful job of stimulating the economy to keep things going. And if you can put another leg down on the stool with a fairly aggressive stimulus from the federal government, it'll be the right necessary kick to get us going directionally where we were as early as the fourth quarter of 2019, where those economic prints were quite good.
It seems like that mindset that Biden might not be bad for the economy, or actually we could potentially have a boom, starting to really creep into Wall Street in general. Is that your sense, that there really is a growing sort of maybe grudging enthusiasm on Wall Street for Biden?
Well, I think so. I mean, Wall Street, you follow the money. And so the donor money on Wall Street, the executive donor money, has gone towards the vice president and away from President Trump. But I also think if you look at the JP Morgan economic research report that came out this week, the Goldman research report, or the Moody's report that came out 2 weeks ago, I think the economic consensus is that more jobs will be created under the Biden plan. I think people are worried at the higher income levels of additional taxes. But I don't believe that that's going to be the case, even though they're talking about higher taxes. I'll point everybody to 2009, 10, and 11. President Obama wanted to raise taxes, but he couldn't. The economy was just not healthy enough to do that. And I will point out, when those tax increases did go through, we were still reasonably high on deficit spending, way less than we are right now. And I'm talking pre-COVID stimulus deficit spending. You know, the president was spending over $1 trillion in his budgets, up from like 500-600 billion for the Obama administration. I think we can get back to those healthier levels. And listen, you and I know the challenge for this economy is what Steve Case was just talking about. How do we feed the poor? How do we make the meals more nutritious? How do we create a platform of equal opportunity for people in lower and middle income areas so that they feel aspirational about their lives? And so we have to work on that over the next 5 or 10 years. Political leaders, business leaders, journalists, we all have to work together to solve that problem, and I believe we will.
Yeah, let's do that, and let's talk about that for more in the future. I'm totally with you on that. So one of the things that's okay, there's a few financial things I want to get to. You also mentioned somewhere that, I don't know if it was that same article, probably not, but that growth stocks, and particularly the biggest tech companies, you stay away from. You think generally they're overvalued. And this is something we talk about a lot at Techonomy. I wrote a book on Facebook, et cetera, et cetera. How do you look at the Facebooks, Googles, Amazons, Apples, Microsofts of the world right now?
Well, listen, they're amazing companies. So this and that. When I say that they're overvalued, there's pockets of overvaluation. You know, Amazon may be more overvalued on a PE basis than something like Apple, that's carrying a lot of cash on its balance sheet. But I think there's something more vexing going on, and those companies are not going to like me mentioning this, but I will mention it. Their power bases are such now that if they don't make moves to innovate and disrupt themselves, they may be disrupted by the federal government. And so I point to Steve Jobs as an example. Somebody said, well, why did you get rid of the iPod? It was an amazing product. You shot the iPod. He said, yeah, I shot the iPod before someone else shot the iPod, and I embedded it into the smartphone, the Apple phone that we all know and love. And so I think these tech companies have to recognize that size and economies of scale and the notion that they are delivering low prices to consumers, if you really study the powers of monopolies, that's not going to be enough. And we learn that by breaking up monopolies, we make our societies and our economies more powerful. They've been breaking up monopolies for 1,500 years. And when they broke up the AT&T monopoly, when Judge Harold Green advanced that decree under the Reagan administration, a Republican administration, I might add, breaking that company up unleashed all of those patents from Bell Laboratories, many of which ironically led to the growth of things like Facebook and Amazon and Google. And so I think we have to be careful again. And so I'm just saying something that is of natural course in economic history. I respect those companies. I have an awesome amount of respect for the management teams there. But I think those companies are going to be up against the gauntlet here if they're not careful. And I would recommend that they take the steps themselves before the government takes those steps.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And it is happening whether they like it or not. Let's see the results of the poll, in case that might give us a couple more things to discuss before I let you go here. Okay, in 8 weeks, I expect to be, because we're doing another event in early December, which people will be more confident about the trajectory of the nation. That's the #1 example. That's pretty reassuring. They do believe, this group believes we will have a stimulus. Nice. We can handle the debt. Nice. Recover better with Biden. I think you would agree with that.
Yeah.
Opinion of Trump has diminished over time. People here predominantly support Biden, but not all of them. And 8% support other. That's interesting. 63% expect Biden to win. That seems not too off the beam there. And financial markets, roughly the same as today in early December. Any of that you disagree with? Was that close to what you would have said?
Yeah, I think it's very consistent with what I would say. I guess my quick story for everybody before I leave your great conference is I had lunch with great luck and coincidence with Antonin Scalia in June of 2014. And Barbara Sinatra set it up for me. It was just me and the justice, and we were talking about the Constitution. And I said to the justice, came with my notes from my con law class, and I said, Justice Scalia, what is the most important part of our Constitution? He said something to me that I'll never forget, and I'll share it with everybody. He said, well, Anthony, the language in the North Korean Constitution, the Venezuelan Constitution, and the Russian Constitution are identical to ours. as it relates to human rights and free speech. However, what's different about our Constitution are the articles and the checks and balances and the check on power and the dissolution at the top of power, and a result of which these checks and balances have kept us free, and they've allowed for our country by and large to be a truer meritocracy. Sure, there's pockets of aristocracy and inheritance in our culture, but people like me, people like yourself, were able to rise up from lower income levels to be where we are today. And the justice would say that's a result of the diffusion of power at the top. And so what I would say to people that are in the red there supporting President Trump, just be very careful, because he doesn't have a sense of humor. And when he's saying something to you, he's not joking, okay? He wants to disrupt the system of the power and the institutions of our democracy, and he has no problem subverting those norms. And so if you're a business leader that thinks his policies are better, we could debate that certainly, but I can tell you right now, if he disrupts those norms that are classical to our society, that have been embraced by the international system, that allow this to be such a petri dish for entrepreneurialism, I would say just be very careful there. So for me, even though I'm a Republican, my higher order principle is towards the patriotism and maintaining the integrity of that system.
Yeah, and there's an interesting thing that's happened in making, I think, a lot of people, a lot of Democrats respect Republicans like yourself. And I think there's the possibility for a new kind of dialogue after this is all over, if it ever is all over, or certainly in some slightly more stable future, let's put it that way. Thank you, Anthony. You always deliver. You are so articulate, so thoughtful, and your experience recently gives you even more meat for us to chew on. But
it's been humbling, David.
Very, very much.
Trust me. My experiences have been quite humbling, trust me. But I appreciate being on, and hopefully I get to see you non-virtually sometime in the near future.
Hope so.
Okay,
Thanks so much.